guys, welcome back to the bench. Today I have a really dope full process sketch for you guys because we're going to be doing a 2-point perspective piece from start to finish. And not only are we going to learn a bit about 2-point perspective and extensions, flow, all that good stuff, but we're also going to learn a bit about balancing graffiti's fundamentals with other fundamentals that you might want to implement into your graffiti. Now check this out, if you guys want to download the sketch breakdown, I have the files for that in the description down below. You can go ahead and check that out. Now if you want me to do your name for future episodes, just leave that in the comments down below. Like in today's video, we're going to be doing Skoss's name, a name that one of you guys recommended in the last video. So without wasting any time, the very first thing we're going to do in a sketch is establish our horizon line, and we don't want this to be in the center of the page. I'll explain that here in a minute. After we establish that, we're going to put on 2 vanishing points for our 2-point perspective, and we want those to be as far as possible, and I'll explain that as well in just a minute. So then from there, we want to go ahead and draw a vertical line, and this is going to make up the very edge of our cube that we want to draw, because that's really the goal. We're going to build our piece out of a cube. So here, going from our left-hand vanishing point, we'll draw 2 diagonal lines that'll make up the top and the bottom of the left-hand side of our cube, and then we're going to repeat the same process on the right-hand side to establish the right-hand side of the cube. So we go on over to the right-hand vanishing point, we draw those same diagonal lines, and then we can establish the very edges of that cube here with these 2 vertical lines. Now our cube is done, and after that, we'll connect our corners with these diagonal lines that create an X. Now where those 2 diagonal lines meet is the perfect center of that surface, and we can use that perfect center to draw a vertical line, and that vertical line will separate our first letter from our second letter, with each letter fitting into those areas respectively. From there, using that same center, we can also draw our mean line by having a horizontal line travel through the cube and through that center, which once again will put our mean line into perspective. So now we effectively have our cap line at the very top of the cube, our mean line in the center of that cube, and then our baseline at, well, you guessed it, the bottom of the cube. Once we have all those things marked out, we can go ahead and begin drawing our S, and you'll see that our S actually extends beyond its little zone that I made for it, and this is perfectly fine. This is one of those things that we have to contend with as artists. When you begin to mix different fundamentals together from different art forms, say for example graffiti not really having a high priority on forms, and then mixing in perspective, which has a massive priority on forms, you have to begin to think to yourself, alright, well, how's perspective going to interact with graffiti's fundamentals? How's it going to change those things? And when it comes to 2-point perspective, it's going to change the letter structure very drastically. In fact, it can oftentimes break letter structures. So to give our letters more structure, to give our letters a little bit more leniency, we can go ahead and extend some of our letters beyond the located zone that I made for it. And that's perfectly okay. Once again, as long as your letter structure is still fine at the end of the day. Think of it as we kind of sacrifice a little perspective for a little letter structure. And because we are doing graffiti, letter structure is at the top of the hierarchy and we're good to go. So now let's kind of dial it back a bit. Why didn't I want that horizon line, and why didn't I want that vertical line in the center of the page? I mean, putting these lines in the center of the page would certainly make the perspective a lot easier to do, but what you gain with ease of use, you lose in dynamism. We don't have as dynamic of an image when everything is perfect center. So in order to add a little bit of drama to the image, if you will, I wanted to go ahead and lower that horizon line. Not by much, but just a little bit. The lower we make that horizon line, the more we're going to distort our letters as well, so we kind of need to balance that too. And the same thing goes for the vertical line. If that line is dead center in our image, then the left-hand side of our piece and the right-hand side of the piece are going to be the same size, and that can perfectly work. That's not a problem necessarily, but once again, we want dynamism, we want drama, we want more intrigue, and to do that, we shift that line a little over to the right-hand side of the page. And what this does is it shrinks the right-hand side of our piece here, and it extends the left-hand side of our piece. Now that's going to create a big issue, something that we'll have to contend with a little bit later, so we'll come back around to that. For now, we have to talk about these diagonal lines I'm putting in on the S. Now this is really important because we are doing 2-point perspective graffiti. Perspective is ranked higher on our fundamental hierarchy, and as a result, we need to consider its fundamentals a lot more than we typically would for your average piece of graffiti. Let's say you were an architect, right? You would create a secondary vanishing point for your diagonal lines, like this one on the back of the S. And this secondary vanishing point would be located underneath your very first vanishing point. So you see that vanishing point over on the left-hand side? Well, our secondary vanishing point for diagonal lines would be underneath that, and that's where our diagonal lines would converge to. Same thing for diagonals that are going upwards. To explain how this secondary vanishing point might function in the real world, so let's say you have a box of pizza, and you rip that bad boy open, you open that box of pizza, so now the edges of your pizza box are no longer parallel and perfectly horizontal. They're now going diagonally up because you lifted the lid open, and as a result, those diagonals would have to converge at a vanishing point higher than your initial vanishing point. In this case, same thing is happening. We are lowering that part of the S S, so those diagonals would converge lower. Now here's the thing, because we are doing a 2-point perspective graffiti, we need to think about how these perspective rules and these graffiti rules are going to collide with one another. They're not always going to agree. They're going to disagree on a lot of things, because in some instances, having my diagonal lines converge at these vanishing points is going to take away too much letter structure, and it'll end up destroying the letter. Now, because we are doing graffiti here, that's our primary concern, graffiti's fundamentals. And as a result, sometimes we're going to want those perspective fundamentals to take a back seat. We're not always going to want to abide by those. But when we choose to disregard those fundamentals, it has to make sense. We can't sacrifice form. Now, let's talk about why you want your vanishing points so far away from one another. Typically, I like to do my perspective digitally nowadays because, well, I have an infinite amount of space to put my vanishing points. But I no longer have the space with my recording setup. It's a bit tight on my desk here. So for this image, I had to settle for putting my vanishing points pretty close to one another. And the reason this is a big deal is because the closer your vanishing points are, the more unnatural your perspective looks, and the more drastic the effect of perspective will have on your forms. You can even try this out at home. If you go ahead and you try to draw a cube with two vanishing points that are pretty close, it's gonna look a little weird. The further you stretch those vanishing points out, the better it's gonna look. So even something like this is a little bit closer of a vanishing point that I would personally like. I would really like those a lot more stretched out. But we'll settle here, right? We'll make this work out. We don't complain, we find solutions. That's what we do. Now, we'll save more of the perspective talk once we actually have the piece drawn in there. That way it's easier to follow along, it's easier to see what we're talking about. So let's talk about the letters real quick. Right now we're establishing the O, and it's at this point we're beginning to shift from the left-hand vanishing point to the right-hand vanishing point. And as you'll see, I went ahead and raised the O up just a little bit. This is because I know I want the leg of the K to shoot underneath the O, not only holding the O up, but I want it to connect to the S, because I know that the S is going to be very similar to the one I already have. And notice the bottom of the first S ends a little higher up, and it has that extension that I began doing that kind of arcs back downward. This is a perfect opportunity to connect the K to the S. So we're going to do exactly that. But on top of that, I already have an idea in mind for my O's extension. And I want this extension to start off with a compressed extension, which we're drawing in right now, and then it's going to shoot off to the bottom left of that O. The reason we want this is because it's really going to emphasize that shift in perspective, and it's going to allow us to overlap plenty of forms. Now, I kind of made a bit of a mistake here because I initially wanted the letters on the right-hand side to be made out of the 3D from the letters on the left-hand side. But I kind of forgot that for a different idea I had, and the other idea was to have the K turn as a rounded form into the other letters. So in my mind, at this point in the drawing, I hadn't decided on which way I wanted to take that, and I forgot to sketch in the line that separates the K's letter structure from its 3D. And as a result of me forgetting to draw that line, I just ended up going with rounding the K's structure into the other letters, meaning that the letters on the right-hand side are not made out of the 3D from the first two letters. Oh well, no big deal. You know, we're not going to cry over spilled milk here. So we're going to keep it moving with the extension here on the O. To take a step away from perspective real quick and kind of talk about my inspirations as an artist when it comes to graffiti, I find that not only is perspective a very big inspiration, but I also really enjoy a lot of the older school stuff. Now, don't get me wrong, I also like a lot of the newer school stuff. You guys have seen my work in the past. You've seen my more like wild style type graffiti, but lately I've really enjoyed looking back at some of my dad's work, which he recently gave me his black book. I made a video about that, and these once again are some big inspirations. So here, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, we're not trying to do anything crazy. I'm trying to take in some of those old school inspirations from my childhood and put a new spin on them. And I feel like through perspective I can do that, right? I can take some of those letter structures, which we're using here with the S, the K, the O, and the S again for the final letter, and we can use some of the extensions and once again put a new spin on them. But the question becomes, how do they use them? How do they use these letter structures, and especially how do they use the extensions? What do they use them for, and how do they look? You know, when we're trying to kind of bring forward our inspirations, we never really want to copy the inspiration. We don't want to look at an old school piece per se and, go ahead and reproduce the extension one for one. Instead, we want to analyze why they use the extension and how they fundamentally used it. So when looking at Demer's work, for example, I can look at a serif, or I can look at a letter distortion and say, all right, well, he bends his D. Pause. That sounds a bit weird. Let me, I could have chose any other letter, but no, that's what I went with. All right, so Demer goes ahead and bends any of his letters in such a way where it'll create this little little peak, kind of like what we have here on the S on the left-hand side. And then he'll shoot that downwards, which builds a lot of weight and eats up a lot of negative space. This is great. This is actually really useful for us. It's something that we can also do on some of our letters in order to, in this case, add a lot more depth through two-point perspective. But not only that, he oftentimes go on to add a very massive serif, a serif that once again eats up a lot of space. So this is something that we can also kind of make work. Now, I've always kind of liked stars on my graffiti as opposed to arrows, so instead of adding arrows where a lot of old school graffiti artists would add them, I'm going to go ahead and add stars. Now, a lot of old school graffiti artists also add extensions in a way where it kind of looks like you're folding paper. If you have like a strip of paper and you kind of just fold it in on itself a couple of times, they do their extensions much like that. So the extension itself is still going to align with its basic boxes a lot of times. And what I've also noticed a lot of old school graffiti artists do, my dad, you know, Demer, so on and so forth, is they'll actually cut their letter, which is very common in graffiti. That's not anything new, but then they'll take that cut and they'll turn it into an opportunity for, you guessed it, another extension. So we're gonna go ahead and do that quite a bit on this piece as well, most notably on the S, on the bottom of the S. And at the tops of the S, we'll go ahead and use that to fill in negative space. Now, negative space is actually a really big concern for us because we're doing a two-point perspective piece after all, and as a result, we're gonna have a lot of space that we're gonna have to face. So one big problem we're gonna run into is the shift in perspective from the K to the O. When that happens, we're gonna have a void between the K and the O. However, I understand that I'm not really gonna have to worry about that because of how much those 3D forms are gonna overlap into one another. Check out the K right here. The letter structure itself abides by the left-hand perspective, but its 3D is going to abide by the right-hand perspective, and the opposite is true for the O. So that's gonna kind of naturally fill in a lot of that negative space between them, so I'm not really too worried about that. In fact, it becomes almost an opportunity for a lot more depth because we get to overlap so many forms. But we do have to consider our total space. Now, if you read my book, you know all about total space, but I'll summarize it really quick here. Even though we're doing a two-point perspective piece, we still have to consider the total space, which is essentially the very top, the very bottom, and the very left and the right-hand side of our image overall. In this case, that'll be the very bottom of the K, where it kind of rounds out and begins to shift to that other perspective, and the very top of the O at this point. It becomes a little higher later on, but you'll see that later. Now, the left and the right-hand side aren't too big of an issue here, and then the very right of the S and the very left of the other S on the left-hand side of the name. So our negative space on the bottom right and the bottom left of our image as a whole is going to be tremendous, and I have to find a way to fill in some of that space. And then we're going to quickly get into the S here. Now, the S, we begin by establishing its own little space. We pull that cube out just a little bit. You'll see I actually extended its zone forward. That way we can see more of its structure. Had I kept it in that more recessed area that it initially was in, its structure would have been too distorted and I would have lost the letter. We don't want that, right? So we pulled that thing out, and we also kind of stop abiding by some of those secondary vanishing points that we had talked about earlier. Notice how that S is diagonal, and we're not following the secondary vanishing point that it should be following. This is once again because we're prioritizing letter structure above perspective. Understand, because we're doing graffiti, letter structure is by far the most important fundamental. We can't just sacrifice that willy-nilly. The only reason for perspective here is to add depth, to add form. So we'll add that secondary vanishing point and we'll abide by that, more so when it aids us and when it doesn't sacrifice too much letter structure. And that's when we'll go ahead and abide by it. Kind of like right here for the front of the S. That's a perfect example. But other than that, we're gonna kind of sacrifice it when we want as well in order to prioritize more important things. So at this point, we're establishing the S, we're kind of getting a feel for what the final image is going to look like, and all that's left is to establish the bottom portion of the S. Now, because we pulled the S out, we need to consider the depth that we pulled it out. How far did we pull it out? How far in front of the other letters does this S really exist? And as long as you're following your perspective lines, this should be pretty simple to find out. And then once we have that in place, it's really just a matter of figuring out the smaller details. Remember what we said in the last video. We always like to work from the general shapes to the more specific shapes, and you'll see we did exactly that with our two-point perspective graffiti. We started with our general cube that built the entire piece, and then we built out smaller sections for each letter, and then from there we built the specific letters. So we really are going from that general to the more specific shapes. And same is true right here. Now that we have the S, we're trying to figure out more of those specific nuances that are going to make up the details for the S. At this point, we're establishing how the actual extensions are going to connect into the other letters, and this is a perfect time to begin prioritizing perspective again. It's here where we can really begin to focus on our secondary vanishing points, our primary vanishing points, so on and so forth, because we're not sacrificing letter structure at this point. The letters are already established. We don't have to worry about that. We're really just establishing vanishing, extra bits that don't matter too much. Things that are there to fill in negative space, add weight, so on and so forth. And they're going to do that regardless of whether or not they follow the secondary vanishing points or not, so why not follow the other perspective rules, right? That's kind of the logic that we're going into here. At this point, we've pretty much finished sketching our letters, and it's time to start rocking in some 3D in there. And this is pretty simple. The letters on the left are going to have the 3D shoot off to the right, and the letters on the right are going to have the 3D shoot off to the left. And sometimes these different forms are going to interact with one another, and they're going to kind of clip through each other. If you really want to do two-point perspective graffiti, then I highly recommend studying and practicing forms as well as perspective. And separate these two things. When you're practicing forms, just draw forms. Don't worry about perspective at all. Get used to drawing those things. And then as you become more comfortable drawing your cubes, cylinders, so on and so forth, then apply perspective to those. And then, once you get comfortable doing that, begin meshing forms together. Maybe draw a cube with a sphere popping out of it, or maybe draw a sphere with a cone and a cylinder popping out of it. And then do those in perspective. This is going to set you up nicely for doing more two-point perspective graffiti. So here we begin playing around with some of those extensions that we previously talked about. And we're making sure to once again have our extensions abide by vanishing points. Now, because our extensions are prioritizing a lot of perspective fundamentals, anything that our piece lacks in perspective, our extensions are going to make up for. And because we planned the initial piece and the initial lettering using perspective fundamentals, our letters aren't going to look too far off. Our letters are still going to look as if they abide properly by perspective, even though they're not 100% accurate. So anything that our letters lack in true perspective fundamentals, our extensions largely are going to make up for that. So by the end of the piece, everything's going to look like it responds to perspective properly, and nothing's going to be too jarring as far as that's concerned. Now, one of the hallmarks of my style is having 3D extensions. This is something that I've been doing since, I'd say, like 2005 or so, and I really enjoy doing these because they're not really all too difficult to do. As long as you understand forms and as long as you understand perspective, it's something that's pretty easy to implement, and you can really take this as far as you'd like. I mean, you can do a whole nother piece of graffiti inside the 3D if you really wanted to. I mean, it's something that we've done here on the channel before in previous sketches as well. But this piece isn't going to go that crazy. This piece is just going to have extensions that are going to fill in the total space we previously mentioned. Now, here's the thing. Negative space above your letters isn't too problematic because there's nothing to hold up, right? There's nothing for that negative space to really impede, as to where negative space below your letters, below your subject matter, creates anticipation. It makes whatever is above that negative space feel as if it's going to fall down. So any total space that's left over below our image is going to receive a lot of attention. We want to go ahead and solve that, and we do that with not only the extensions we previously mentioned, but the 3D we're going to add as well as the cast shadow we'll be adding later. However, I do want to use the negative space above the letters and that total space above the letters to fill it in with really fun extensions that are going to, well, to be frank, they're going to be fun to implement, and I really want to go ahead and play around with that. So we're spending a lot of time with the extensions from the 3D above the letters. There's a lot of space here, a lot of room for us to play, and a lot of opportunity to add depth with our forms, and that's precisely what we're going to do. We are going to be shading this with not only grayscale but color as well. So this is more of a playground to mess around with a lot of those different values, a lot of those different colors, a lot of those different markers. Now here I'm putting in an extension on the 3D for the O, and I'm realizing, you know, this works, right? This is fine, everything is fine here, but this portion that I'm drawing right now is too close to the K, and I want more negative space there. The reason I want negative space there is because I already know I want a chip back there. A chip that far back is bound to add more depth. It's bound to add more intrigue as well. Not only that, I like to add my chips in prime numbers. It helps to add not only cohesion but balance when you do that. So right now I don't have a prime amount of chips, and I'm thinking in my head, like, I gotta throw one back there. That way not only is it out of the way, it adds more depth, but it completes that prime number I'm looking for to give balance to everything overall. This is something that we're very consistent with in this piece, where we add a prime number of those little circles, a prime number of those little half circle chips, a prime number of your typical chips, and a prime number of exterior bubbles that we kind of put around the piece. You'll see that later on. So here you'll see I'm trying to draw that chip in there, and I'm thinking to myself, man, I can't see enough of that chip. For that, it might as well not even be there. It might as well just not even exist. So I'm gonna kind of play around with different ideas, and ultimately I'm gonna decide to shrink the O's 3D extension in order to leave more room for that chip to exist. Once we get that in there, I'm satisfied, and we can begin working on other extensions like this one here at the top of the S. Even though the letters are in perspective, we have to consider the negative space between letters despite the perspective. So if we look at the top right of the O and the top left of the S, at the end there, we'll see that they're there would be a lot of negative space in that area. We have to fill that. That's not okay to just have. And the 3D from the S shooting over to the left-hand side isn't going to be enough. So what do? We use an extension to fill that negative space. Now, the negative space isn't going to be too detrimental in this case, even if I were to leave it. But if I just left it, we'd also be missing a lot of opportunity for connecting different parts of our letter. And because we need to fill in that negative space anyway, why not look at the top of the S as an opportunity? An opportunity to shoot an extension over to the left-hand side that connects to the compressed extension at the top right of the O. From there, we can add even more extensions on top of the extension. And we can also add 3D extensions in that same area. I'm saying the word extension quite a bit here, but you get the point. By the end of it, we filled in that negative space pretty nicely, and that negative space goes completely unnoticed. It's not something that would really stand out. So I'd say a job well done in that instance. Now, check out where I'm working on this S. Look at that same area. On the first S, we have an extension in this area over there, and I needed to do something similar on this last S. Luckily for me, I already had the idea to have the O shoot an extension through the center of the O upwards towards the middle of the S, and we're going to use that as an opportunity to have the area right here connect to one another, or at least they would have if it had not been for perspective. But giving us that line uniformity and similarity is useful in order to bridge these letters together. Line uniformity and similarity is very easy to do when doing any piece in perspective, whether you're doing a piece that abides by 1-point perspective or 2-point perspective. And the reason for this is because, well, they're all going to be going to, or at least a lot of lines, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of your lines are going to be going to a common vanishing point, which means they're going to be pretty similar to one another. Not only that, our vertical lines are going to seamlessly kind of work together with that line uniformity and similarity as well. So doing line uniformity and similarity with perspective is very, very easy. So check out this extension here on the bottom that we're working on. When you have a straight line like this, that's boring, that's dull. We don't want that. We want to avoid straight lines like this when we can. Sometimes it's good if you want to lead the eye somewhere or you want to build momentum, sure, fine, that's great. But this one specifically, boring, dull, we got to get rid of it. How do we do that? We add a compressed extension on that long line. This breaks up that long line and makes it look more dynamic. Or as we like to say here, it adds drama to that line. We like to add drama to our image whenever we can. So that's exactly what we do, and it also provides a great opportunity not only for another chip, which we add right below it, but also more depth, because guess what? That chip is going to have 3D that extends to the left, and it's going to extend underneath that very same extension, which is going to help with depth. At this point, we're outlining, and I'll be honest, guys, I kind of got tired of using 2 outlining pens because I really miss my brush pen that I had, man. So I went ahead and I ordered a brand new brush pen, which we're not going to be using in this video. At this point, it's coming in the mail, but I got it currently, like while I'm recording this audio right now, and it's a beautiful brush pen. I can't wait to use it for the next draw along. But for this one, we're using 2 different outliners, one thick, one thin, and we're actually gonna do something pretty interesting here. Because we're focusing on 2-point perspective, because we're focusing so much on depth, we really want to outline our letters with our bolder, thicker outline. This adds not only more letter structure because it separates the letters from everything else and makes them easier to see, but it also adds depth because if you want to make something look closer to you, you give it a thicker outline. And then if you want to make something look further away, you give it a thinner outline in order to simulate that atmospheric perspective. So that's going to be what we do here. You'll notice once we begin working on the actual 3D itself, we implement a lot more thin outlines. In fact, in some areas, we don't even outline. We just decide, you know what, I'm leaving that for the markers. I'm leaving that for the coloring stage, for the shading stage. And this is something that any of you guys can do on your graffiti as well. It doesn't have to be 2-point perspective. You can just do this on normal graffiti. If you want to have your 3D kind of go in any direction, and as your 3D gets further away from the letters, you use a thinner and thinner outline, that's perfectly fine. That's bound to give you a lot more depth. And as long as your letter structure is good, as long as your 3D is proper, it's going to look really nice. And that's the process we're going to follow throughout the entire 3D. Now, you also don't have to do this at all, or you can do it to a much more dramatic effect. Some people like to use outlining as a way to shade. And before they begin inking, they'll already have their lighting in mind. They'll say, for example, maybe my light's coming from the top left, and as a result of that, any outlines on the right-hand side of a form are going to get a thicker, bolder line to simulate a shadow, while any lines on our left-hand side that are facing the actual light source, those are going to get a thinner line to simulate that they're being lit. Now, this isn't nearly as easy to do in general, and it's certainly a lot harder to do for graffiti. For most pieces, they wouldn't be able to make use of that kind of lighting convention because they would need to have a high emphasis on forms, and that high emphasis is seldomly seen in graffiti. Now, it's actually during the outline phase where I realized my mistake. I realized at this point, man, I forgot to turn the O and the S into 3D. I forgot that they were meant to be the 3D of the K, and at this point, I started second guessing things. I started thinking in my head, man, what am I going to do for the fill-in? Because having the O and the S actually be created from the 3D, that defines the actual fill-in, because those two letters would be filled in with the 3D color, and their 3D would be the fill-in color for the first two letters. So I was a little disappointed by that, but I decided, you know what, this is fine. I'm gonna have to settle for that. It's whatever, and we'll make it work. We find solutions. Now, something to mention as well is when you outline something with a thinner line, it also receives less attention. It has less weight. Because we have so much 3D above the letters, it's important that we outline a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of it, with a thinner line, because we don't want that to really get into a fight with the letters, right? We want the letters to be dominant. We want those to really be the thing that stands out. This is graffiti after all. Letters are the most important thing. So to keep the letters highest in the hierarchy, we outline them with the boldest lines. Now, while we have some time here as the kind of sketch continues and we're not really doing anything too fancy, I wanted to go ahead and throw something out there. As you guys know, here on the channel, we have a lot of informative content. We have a bunch of tutorials, we have critique videos, so on and so forth. But I want to take things a step further and really evolve the channel to what I believe to be the next stage. And I think what that looks like for the channel is bringing you guys a college level curriculum for graffiti. Now, we're not making like a college, an actual proper college school or anything, but I want to give you guys the opportunity to have a course that would be at a college level. And this would cover not only graffiti's fundamentals, but it would cover just general art fundamentals as well. So you guys would end up learning things like realistic perspective and how to shade forms properly, so on and so forth. And because it would be a graffiti course, you would learn how to implement that into your actual graffiti as well. And to be clear, once again, these courses would be focused on giving you a college level curriculum, not only for graffiti, but for general art skills as well. But on top of that, if you've downloaded the previous sketchbook file, or if you download this one, you'll see it says Artist Block Academy. And what this is all about is I want to build a community of people that want to learn graffiti. And that community would be something that you can join on top of this channel. Something that would be, once again, a community of people that want to learn graffiti, that gets special classes and special information, special perks that they can enjoy and that they can learn from. So the courses would be a bunch of very long, very detailed videos that are fully narrated and pretty much a step-by-step guide throughout the lessons with assignments that you could do on your own time, as well as files for practices and so on and so forth. It's a lot of content to put together, so we're still very much in the planning phase. So for right now, we're gonna hop back into the sketch and talk about some of the things that are going on here. Now, the outlining process is a lengthy one, and it's also pretty much the part of this image that took the longest. So we're gonna speed this along and we're gonna get to the fun part, the markers. Now, here we begin with the shading, and I decide, you know what? We're gonna do a simple grayscale for the things that are facing the light source. So the S and the K, they're gonna get a very soft, gentle lighting. And for that, we're gonna keep most of the S white. We're not actually gonna really fill it with much of anything. And if we do, it'll be our absolute brightest gray that's more of a 10% gray. It's hardly visible at all. We found that out the hard way on my last drawing for this series. For the most part, it's gonna stay predominantly white. And then towards the bottom right of that form, we're gonna start to give it a little bit of a darker gray. Now, it's still not dark in the grand scheme of things. We still want it to be very light because after all, it is facing the light source, but we do want some contrast there. Here we begin to illustrate a little clip effect that happens when two forms begin to occupy the same space, you could say. They clip together, and you can see that with the bottom of the S clipping into the K. Also, for any forms that are tucked underneath our piece, like the chip beneath the S and the K, they're gonna get a darker value because they're kind of, once again, buried underneath our graffiti. The sunlight has a bit of trouble reaching that area. So that gets a bit darker, and we're gonna repeat this process throughout the entire letters. As you can see here, we're going in with our not too dark of a gray in order to make sure that the S gets some kind of value. Make sure that we also blend that first gray we put in into the white. That's gonna help blend things together just a little bit, make that transition a little bit smoother. Now, the S is kind of fading away. It's kind of leaning away from the sunlight. That's why it's clipping into the K. But that means that the K is facing the sunlight more directly, meaning it's going to be lighter in value. It's not gonna receive as much shading like the S did. And as a result of that, we're only gonna focus on the occlusion shadows for the K here from the forms that are overlapping it. Now, as the K's leg shoots down towards the O, it begins to rotate towards that other perspective, that other vanishing point. So we're gonna begin to shade it. That way you can see that rotation happening, and we can make that a more convincing rotation. It make it clear to the viewer that, hey, the perspective here is definitely changing. At that point, everything is going to get shaded. So we'll shade the entire O, we'll shade the entire S. However, we understand that our actual markers themselves, the colors, are going to darken the actual value inherently. So for that reason, we're not going to shade the O and the S all too dark. We want to shade them very gently, very modestly. That way we don't overshoot the dark values later on. Because once once again, when we layer the yellow fill-in on top of the O and on top of the S, it's gonna darken no matter what we do. So we put in a nice gentle gray here on the O and the S, and that sets us up pretty nicely. But as we get further away from the sunlight, as we get deeper into the S, we're gonna get darker and darker. Now, once again, we have to be very careful with our values here. We don't want to rush the dark values. So we put a bit of a limit on ourselves. We say to ourselves, all right, we're gonna work from a value scale of 10 to 40%. And even 40%, that's gonna be our darkest darks pretty much. And we're really gonna be using 10 to 30% to shade the letters with. Now, the 30% is what you're seeing here on the actual S itself. And for the occlusion shadows, maybe we'll bust out the 40. Because what's gonna end up happening is, sure, we're working with a 10 to 30% as far as our markers are concerned. Once we throw on the yellow fill-in color, that yellow is gonna take that 30 and move it to 40. It's gonna take the 20 and move it to 30. It's gonna take the 10 and move it to 20. So we want to kind of have that in mind right from the start. Now, as we go into the 3D, we can get a little darker here. It's okay to get darker values because this isn't our letter structure. If we got too dark with our letter structure, then guess what? We're sacrificing letter structure. We don't want to do that, at least not too much. So for our 3D, we can work with 40s and 50s potentially, and that'll be perfectly fine. However, we still want to tread lightly. We still want to have a bit of an easy going hand when it comes to our values here. We're not going to rush to our darks. Markers are easy to build, right? So we can start with a 20, 30, 40% gray, and if we need to, we can bump that up to a 50. We don't have to rush to get to the 50. So that's the process we'll follow when doing our forms here. And we're always considering our light source. Our light source is on the top left of the image, and it's shining down towards the S and the K in perspective. So that means that in these little crevices for the 3D, it's gonna be pretty dark. Light struggles to get into there, but light bounces around, and it is still able to get into a lot of these areas. It's not gonna be able to get into everywhere, but that's where our occlusion shadows get put into. The way I like to think of it, and the way that I kind of had it taught to me, was imagine if it's raining from your light source. Like literally, if you have a light bulb, rain is shooting out of that thing. If you're standing underneath an umbrella, the light's gonna hit the top of the umbrella, but it's not gonna hit the bottom. Everything the rain isn't hitting is a shadow. And that's exactly kind of the mentality we're going into this shading process with. We're imagining our light as rain, it's coming down, and it's hitting this part of the form, lighting that area up, it's getting rained on, and everything that is not being rained on, well, that's where a shadow is going to go. Maybe it's getting a little wet, and as a result, it's receiving a little bit of light. So it's not gonna get as dark as an area that's getting absolutely no rain at all. That's, once again, the way I was, kind of taught it. That's kind of the way I think of it. If it's easier for you to think of it in that way, then, maybe that helps. But if not, what I recommend if you want to learn this topic is study light and form, study value as well. Those are the elements of art that you really want to focus on when learning that topic. And you don't have to study forms in perspective for this. You can light a form without it being in perspective. So I recommend doing that. Take a couple cubes, draw them on a page, don't put them into perspective, and try to light them realistically. The goal here should be to get to a point where you don't have to outline anything, where you don't see the actual sketch or the actual outline itself. That's how you know you have enough values. That's how you know you've done a good enough job shading, because you don't need the actual line itself to depict the form. The values will do that for you. So that should be the goal. When you first start off, expect to have an outline, expect to need the outline in order to compensate for what you're not able to shade, and that's perfectly well and good, but once again, as you get better, you'll need that line less and less. In fact, maybe next time, I'm kind of putting a lot on my plate with this one, but maybe next time we do one of these, we won't use any outline at all, just to kind of show how that would work. Now, this shading process is a lengthy one, and you'll notice on the right-hand side of the piece, we have a lot more values, a lot more shading happening. And what we need to understand about this is that that's going to have a lot of weight. This right here is what we mentioned in the very beginning of the video, where I said I shifted the vertical line for our initial general cube. I shifted that to the right. And the reason I did that was because it's going to shrink the right-hand side of the name, giving the right-hand side of the name less weight, giving more weight to the left-hand side of the name. Now, the reason I did this was because I knew that I wanted my light source on the left-hand side, meaning the right letters are going to be darker, and darker values have more weight. So having the right-hand side be smaller to shrink the weight was a way for me to compensate for the weight I was going to add in the shading process. Had the left and the right-hand side been of equal size, then the right-hand side of the name would have weighed more because of the darker values. It's also part of the reason why we add so many extensions on the left-hand side of the name, and why we also made sure a lot of those extensions popped into the total space at the top of the letters. This was all done in an effort in order to make sure the left-hand side had sufficient weight. Because another thing that we need to think about is the fact that a cast shadow is going to be going to the right-hand side as well. Now, the cast shadow is a natural occurring thing, so it may not have as much weight as other subjects in our image, because it's something that we're just going to kind of register, see, and because there's so little detail there, we're not going to pay it much attention. But it is still something that's taking up space, something that's adding visual weight, and as a result, we need to consider that as well. Now we begin coloring, and coloring with alcohol-based markers is very similar to glazing with oil paints, right? It's a bunch of thin layers that you're going to layer on top of one another in order to get the desired effect. So we're going to lay down these blues on top of the actual 3D itself, and we're going to use two different kinds of blues. We're going to use a light blue as the local color, the general color, if you will, and then we're going to use a slightly darker, more saturated blue for the shadows. Now, the reason I want to do this is because the light blue doesn't have all that large of an effect on the grays, and the grays can be a little overpowering. They could sap out a lot of the color, a lot of the life out of the markers, so I want to put some of that life back in there with a more saturated blue, and we're going to reserve that more so for the shadows, where the gray is really sapping a lot of the life out of my markers. And we'll let the light blue, that really soft, gentle blue, influence a lot of the lighter areas, where the life isn't being sucked out of the marker. On top of that, we're also adding a nice, really neat purple to the shadows, because this is going to once again add a little bit more dynamism, a lot more drama to our shadows. Shadows in real life are not just one color. If you look at your skin, you might look at the shaded area and think, oh, that's just a darker color of my actual skin color. The answer is no. Lights bounce around quite a bit, and when they bounce around, they carry other colors from their surroundings. Because we're not getting crazy into realistic reflective lights in this image, I want to keep things simple, and I want to keep the shadow color something that feels natural to the color blue. And for that, this is going to be a nice purple. Now, we don't want this purple to be all that dark. We don't need it to be all that dark. We don't need to grab like a Grimace purple or a Barney purple in order to shade your blues. You just need a soft lilac, right? That's really all you need. And with that, you're going to get a nice, rich, vibrant shadow. If you grab your Barney purple, it's going to sap all the color, all the life out of your image. It's going to get too dark too fast. Remember, when creating art, we want to make soft changes first and get progressively more intense as things go. We want to build up and work our way towards the final goal. We don't want to rush there. It's a marathon, not a sprint, right? So that's all we're really doing. And honestly, at this point, my big concern is the yellows. Even though we're filling in the blues, I'm very concerned about the yellows, because the yellows are going to be very influenced by the grays. So I'm already thinking about how I want to handle that. As a test, I go ahead and I decide I'm going to go ahead and color some chips here. And I done messed up. I colored these two chips and I thought, damn it, I didn't mean to color that side. No! Alright, so check this out. These two chips here in the center of the piece, they overlap one another. And one chip is coming from the K, the other one is coming from the O. However, I kind of colored the fill-in section for the chip on the O, I colored it blue. And the 3D section of that very same chip, I colored it yellow. It's supposed to be the other way around. But I was so salty when I did that. I was so mad. But once again, we find solutions. We don't complain is what I'm trying to tell myself as I cope with what I've just done here. But I want to show you guys at the end of this video, I want to show you guys what the piece would have looked like if I just made that simple change. So I'll show you guys both. I'll show you the final image with my mistake, and then I'll show you the final image with the digital correction, if you will, just so you guys can see. Man, I wish I didn't make that mistake, but it is what it is. And that's pretty much the process for this piece. So we're going to start off with the purple, we're going to lay that down, and then we're going to come in with our blue, and we're going to go over that in order to blend that purple out, in order to kind of make it less harsh of an edge that we're leaving behind. And then we're going to take our lightest blue, and we're going to go over all of that in order to unify all those colors, and in order to once again soften things up. If we need a hard edge somewhere, we'll go ahead and we'll put it back. That's no big deal. But let's soften these edges up quite a bit. That way things look more natural. And you know what? This is actually a really good point. You do want hard edges. You don't want everything to be soft. You don't want to over blend everything. But at this point, I've done a lot of that work with the actual grayscale itself. So I'm trying to soften the blues and the purples I'm implementing as opposed to soften the grays. And once again, like I previously said, if we need a hard edge somewhere, we can easily put that back in there. And here you'll see me messing up again by painting that area, this chip, blue. Luckily, we do take a marker to it and we color it orange or yellow later on. But I'll be honest with you guys, I was watching YouTube videos on the side and I was very distracted. So I have to be transparent and say I was not giving 100% attention at this time, which is important that we do. You know, So this was a friendly reminder, hey, maybe you should be paying attention to what it is you're doing. Now, for the actual fill-in, when we begin implementing the yellows in here, I decided that I really need to combat these grays. Yellow has the highest natural value out of any color in existence, right? Especially with how transparent, and more so how transparent the markers are. Gray's gonna have a big impact on our yellows, and I want to really enrich these yellows. So we're gonna cover everything with a flat yellow first, just to make sure we have that base to work with on the O and the S. After we go ahead and we implement that flat base, we'll then go ahead and come back in with more oranges and other colors on top of that. Now, unfortunately, my camera, for some reason, the memory card wasn't working. I wasn't able to record that part of the process. So I guess I lied when I said this was a full process video, but we do go back in with some oranges and some yellows. Now, just to kind of describe how that process went very quickly, because I mean, you guys can't really watch it, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but just to describe for you guys what happened there was, once again, we put the flat yellow in, and you'll see how influential those grays were. From there, we went in with some oranges, and we put those into some shadow areas, and then we quickly blended those oranges out using the same yellow fill-in we initially started our base with. From there, it was a matter of just putting in some interior details, and the fill-in the yellow area was done. Now, for our exterior detail, I love doing these little things, these little bubbles. A lot of people you see in graffiti, they'll do like bubbles around their piece. I took that idea, and I thought it'd be really fun in order to turn those into like little cardboard cutouts that you can kind of stick onto the letters themselves and put those around, since we are messing with perspective. So that's what we went ahead and did, and we filled those in with a nice pink. We're working with a triadic colors. Oh, you know what I just realized? You know, last video, I said I'm not doing orange or yellow and blue and pink, and that's exactly what I did. Oh my god. Old habits die hard, man. I'm telling you, next time we're not doing this. I'm taking the yellows, I'm taking the blues out of my marker set. We're working with different colors. But anyway, to get back on topic, we fill in the pinks here, and I wanted these to be a little bit more translucent, a little bit more transparent. So what we did was we took a blue marker, and where the 3D would show through these exterior details, we made sure to go ahead and use the blue marker there. And then we also emphasized some of those areas with color pencils as well, using purples and pinks to not only darken with the purple, but also to bring some of that pink color from the exterior detail back into those more translucent areas. From there, it was a matter of getting the drop shadow locked in, and this time we're not making the same mistake that we made last time. Last time I made the drop shadow, or I'm sorry, I made the cast shadow way too light to the point where you can hardly see it. This time we decided we're working with a 20 and 30% gray, and I believe a 40% gray for deep underneath the letters. So here you'll have the 30% gray we're knocking in, and that's going to be pretty much everywhere. And then we'll use the 20% gray to soften edges up and to give a slight shadow around the very edge of our actual cast shadow. Almost as if the shadow is getting lighter as it goes. And then in the darker areas here, that's a 40% gray if I remember correctly, and that's for areas that the light is really struggling to reach into. This should give us a much more natural shadow, something that looks a little bit more believable, and add a little bit of pop to the actual letters themselves. Now, personally, I like my shadows to be a little bit lighter than this. Not as light as we had last time, but lighter than this, and I feel like that gives a much more believable presence, but I like the way this came out. Now, this cast shadow is not at all accurate. Let me go ahead and say that right off the bat. This cast shadow only is there to give the illusion of depth and, once again, that presence of the actual cast shadow being there. If you really wanted to do a cast shadow in perspective, I actually showed that in the last sketch along video, but here all we really need is a general shape in order to be believable, and as long as that general shape resembles the piece itself, it's believable and it'll work out. This goes right back to what we talked about earlier about prioritizing different fundamentals for what it is you're trying to achieve. In this instance, I didn't want the cast shadow to extend off the actual page itself, because that would actually flatten the image, and if I had abided by actual realistic perspective, then the cast shadow certainly would have extended way off the actual paper itself, which we didn't want. So for that reason, we chose to go with a general shape of the actual piece itself laying on the ground. That way the whole image can be contained on the paper itself, and that way nothing's really chopped off by the edge of the page. So here's the final image. Let me know what you guys think about it. Here's the actual image, true to life, you know, no corrections made, and then here's the image with that one chip changed the way that I wanted it to be. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below, and don't forget to leave your names in the comments for the next episode. And be sure to pick up the downloadable file we have in the description down below. And while you're down there, pick up our brand new book. It teaches you all of graffiti's fundamentals. That way you could do pieces like this. Now, if you guys want to learn how to practice effectively, check out this video here on the bottom. And if you guys want the best how to do graffiti tutorials anywhere online, check out this playlist right up here at the top. And I'll catch you guys back here next week. Thanks for watching.